On Sawtooth Pass, snow didn't just fall, it buried sound, roads, and the pass Benton Cross tried to leave behind. For years, the former mountain rescue veteran lived alone, with his wife's photographs turned down and her red rope untouched by the door. But Sutter, the German shepherd Mara once trained, still remembered what Benton wanted to forget. When a stranded bus vanished into the white near mile marker 19, Winter called Benton back before he was ready. The people waiting in that storm were not weak, they were proud, wounded, and running out of time. To bring them home, Benton would have to face the mountain, the memory of Mara, and the last white mile. Stay with this story, and if it touches you, share where you're watching from and what it made you feel. Winter did not arrive in Elkhorn Crossing so much as settle over it with the patience of something old and certain. By early December, the road beneath Sawtooth Pass had narrowed between snowbanks as high as fence rails, and the pine forest above town stood heavy and silent, each branch bent under a white burden that made even the wind sound muffled. Sound changed in that country once the snow grew deep. Engines came softened. Footsteps disappeared. A man could stand outside at dusk and feel as if the whole world had been wrapped in wool, leaving him alone with whatever he had not managed to forget. Benton Cross knew that silence better than anyone. At 47, he still carried himself with the straight-back discipline of a former Army National Guard mountain rescue man, though the years had weathered him into something harder and quieter than uniformed service ever had. His face was rugged and angular, marked by light creases around calm blue-gray eyes that noticed weather before conversation, exits before greetings, and danger before most people knew to name it. His short military haircut had gone a little iron at the edges, and the skin across his cheekbones held the dry burn of winters spent outdoors. He lived alone in a cabin below the pass, where the ridge blocked the morning sun until late, and the snow gathered so thick along the eaves that the roof seemed to lower a few inches with every storm. The cabin had once been a home built for two voices. Now it held the careful order of one man trying not to leave traces he would have to explain. For 3 weeks, Benton had been packing without telling anyone he was leaving. He folded wool shirts into cardboard boxes, wrapped tools in old feed sacks, and stacked field manuals beside a crate of maps he had not opened in years. He took down 2 photographs from the wall over the wood stove and placed them face down on the kitchen table, then left them there because putting them in a box felt too final and hanging them back up felt too dishonest. One showed him and Mara Cross standing in front of the Old Cross Winter Guide Service sign, both of them younger, snow-bright, and windburned after a training route on Ridge Lantern Trail. Mara had been laughing in that picture, one gloved hand resting on the shoulder of a young German shepherd whose ears looked too large for his head. The other photograph showed Mara alone in a red winter rescue jacket, her chestnut hair tied back, a coil of rope over one shoulder, her pale green eyes aimed at the camera with the steady patience of a woman who had never believed fear should be denied, only prepared for. Benton did not throw either photograph away. He was not cruel enough for that, not even to himself. He only turned them down and worked around them, as though avoiding their eyes would make leaving easier. Mara had been gone for years, but the cabin still knew her. Her rescue whistle hung from a nail by the door. Her red technical markers lay in a tin box on the shelf above the radio. The old rope she had favored, faded now from weather and use, remained coiled under the bench where she had always kept it because a rope you have to search for is already too late. Benton heard that sentence often, never as a ghostly whisper, never as anything supernatural, just memory doing what memory did, repeating the things that had mattered when the person who said them no longer could. Mara had trained search and rescue dogs for volunteer winter teams, and she had believed preparation was a form of mercy. She had marked trails before storms, taught handlers to read exhaustion in both men and animals, and tied red reflectors on trees in places where a panicked person might choose the wrong slope. She had died during a wide-out rescue on a night Benton still replayed with useless precision. His route choice had not been reckless. That was part of what made it unbearable. He had chosen according to the map, the wind, the time, the information they had. Then the pass changed. Snow cornices shifted. Visibility collapsed. Mara had turned back to help someone who had fallen behind, and by morning the team returned without her. No investigation blamed Benton. No one in Elkhorn Crossing said he had killed his wife. They did not need to. Benton had been saying it to himself for years in quieter, more careful language. After that winter, he stopped guiding. He stopped taking calls for ridge rescues. He stopped teaching rope lines and whiteout spacing. People still came to him when their generator died or a chimney cap iced over, because Benton could repair nearly anything that had bolts, wire, or a reason for failing. He helped old neighbors shovel out after storms, cleared roofs before they buckled, and checked on remote cabins when asked, but he did it in a way that gave no one room to call him back inside for coffee. He would fix the machine, lift the beam, clear the drift, nod once, and leave before gratitude became conversation. Elkhorn Crossing respected that kind of sorrow because mountain towns knew better than to pry open a wound in public. Still, respect and loneliness could live side by side, and Benton had let them do that for too long. Now he had decided, quietly and without ceremony, that when spring broke the pass open, he would sell the cabin and drive west until Idaho's mountains no longer rose in every rearview mirror. Sutter was the only thing in the house that refused to cooperate with the leaving. The German Shepherd was 6 now, fully grown into a powerful, steady working dog with a thick black and silver sable coat, charcoal dark along the back and pale ash at the chest and legs. One ear carried a small nick from an old training accident, and his amber eyes had the grave intelligence of an animal who had learned that stillness could be more useful than noise. He had been Mara's dog first, though Benton never said it that way out loud. Sutter had learned her hand signals, her whistle tones, the scent of her jacket, the difference between a search pattern and a walk, between a body lying still from sleep and a body lying still from cold. After Mara died, Sutter stayed with Benton not as a replacement for her but as proof that something she had loved still breathed inside the cabin. Benton could pack books and tools. He could wrap plates and newspaper. He could take down photographs. But every time he tried to move Mara's rescue gear into a storage box, Sutter appeared.
It began with small refusals. Benton would place the whistle in a box, and by evening Sutter would be lying beside the box, head across his paws, eyes open. Benton would roll the Ridge Lantern trail map and set it near the door, and Sutter would drag it gently back toward the hearth without tearing it. Once, Benton found the old red rescue rope lying in the center of the kitchen floor, uncoiled with such care that he stood for a long time staring down at it, unsure whether to be angry, tired, or grateful that the dog had not forgotten the shape of its purpose. "We're done with that," Benton told him. Sutter had only looked toward the window, where the road climbed white and narrow into the trees. The dog never argued, never whined, never made his loyalty sentimental. That was what made it hard. He simply remembered. One late afternoon, the sky above Sawtooth Pass darkened before it should have. Benton stood outside in the blue-gray light with a wrench in one hand, loosening the bolts that held the Old Cross Winter Guide Service sign to its posts. The sign had weathered badly. Snow had peeled the paint. One corner had cracked. Beneath the old lettering, the shadow of Mara's hand-painted compass rose still showed faintly. Benton had told himself removing it was practical. A vacant service sign invited questions, and questions invited explanations. The first bolt turned reluctantly. The second screamed against the cold metal. As he worked, the wind shifted down the pass, carrying the dry, hollow bite that came before a serious storm. From inside the cabin, the weather radio crackled to life, its alarm tone thin and mechanical through the walls. Benton stopped, wrench still in his hand. He could hear only fragments at first. Major winter system, Sawtooth Pass, whiteout potential, travel not advised, possible closure for multiple days. He went inside long enough to slap the radio off. The silence after the warning felt almost accusatory. "Not my work anymore," he said, to the empty room or to himself. "They have crews. They have radios. They have people."
When he turned back toward the door, Sutter was standing in the hallway with Mara's red rescue rope in his mouth. The dog had pulled it from beneath the bench again, but this time he did not drop it near the stove or beside the map. He carried it all the way to Benton's boots, set it down with deliberate care, and sat facing the window that looked toward the pass. Snow had begun to fall harder outside, not drifting now but coming down in fine, fast lines that erased the trees beyond the yard. Benton stared at the rope. He wanted to tell the dog no. He wanted to pick it up, put it away, lock it somewhere Sutter could not reach, and finish removing the sign before dark. He wanted leaving to remain a plan and not a confession. But Sutter did not move. The German shepherd sat with that old rescue stillness in his body, ears forward, eyes fixed on the road as if training had drawn a line from the cabin to someone neither of them could see yet. Benton slowly lowered himself onto the bench by the door. For a moment, he felt every year since Mara's death gather in the room, the calls he had ignored, the maps he had closed, the neighbors he had helped from a safe emotional distance, the sign he had almost taken down before the storm could ask anything of him. He looked at Sutter and saw not a miracle, not a message from the dead, not some impossible knowing. He saw a dog trained by a woman who had believed no one should be abandoned to winter simply because helping was costly. That was all. And somehow that was enough to make the air in the cabin change. Outside, Sawtooth Pass disappeared behind thickening snow. Inside, the red rope lay between man and dog like a question Benton had spent years refusing to answer. He did not know about the stranded vehicle yet. He did not know about mile marker 19, or the adults who would soon begin to lose heat on a road the storm was erasing. He only knew that for the first time in years, winter no longer looked like something he could leave behind by driving away in spring. It looked like something still waiting for him to decide who he was when someone out there needed a way home. The storm reached Sawtooth Pass before the forecast had the decency to be wrong in stages. By mid-afternoon, the wind had begun dropping down the high ridges in long, white bursts, pushing snow across the mountain road so fast that the asphalt appeared and vanished like something breathing under a sheet. In Elkhorn Crossing, the town reacted the way mountain towns do when weather stops being background and starts becoming a verdict. Storefront signs were brought in early. Snow shovels leaned ready beside doors. Trucks idled longer than usual in front of the feed store while drivers checked chains, wipers, radios, and the sky. At the sheriff's office, Della Rourke stood over a wall map with one hand wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee she had forgotten to drink. She was 52, square-faced, short-haired, and practical in the unromantic way of people who had buried neighbors after bad weather and learned not to waste time pretending optimism was a plan. Her navy winter sheriff jacket was still zipped from her last call, melted snow darkening the shoulders, and a portable radio hissed beside the map. She did not panic when the first broken transmission came in. Panic was for people who still believed fear improved reception. She only turned the volume higher and listened until the static coughed up enough words to matter. Elkhorn Dispatch. This is Brand Shuttle, near mile marker 19, maybe, can't see the shoulder, heater dropping. The voice was male, older, strained but trying to remain professional. Della picked up the hand mic. Brand Shuttle, this is Sheriff Rourke. Confirm location and passenger count. Static chewed through the answer. Then came pieces. Retreat group, adults only, coming down from the lodge, wide out, rear wheels sliding, battery warning. Della's eyes moved to the map before the voice finished. Mile marker 19 sat on a narrow bend below a side slope where crosswind packed snow faster than plows could cut it. On a clear day, it was only a bad stretch of road. In a storm, it became a place that punished delay. The vehicle was a small shuttle bus returning from a winter retreat held at a lodge above the pass, not a tourist bus full of laughing families or students, but a quiet group of adults who had come to the mountains because somebody had told them recovery sometimes needed distance. Della learned their names in fragments as Otis Brand, the driver, tried to keep his radio alive. Otis was 64, a careful roadman with a thin gray mustache and the deep, apologetic voice of someone already blaming himself for every mile behind them. He had driven winter roads for decades and knew the shame of realizing experience had not prevented danger, only carried people farther into it. Beside him, trying to speak when his signal faded, was Naomi Voss, a former emergency nurse whose calm sounded practiced enough to worry Della. Naomi reported symptoms before emotion, one passenger shivering uncontrollably, another short of breath from panic and cold, everyone layered but losing heat. She did not mention her own shaking until Della asked twice. Behind her, Harlan Greer's voice broke in once, hard and irritated, insisting he could walk if he had to and did not need anyone making a project out of him. Della knew the type before she knew the man, retired firefighter, according to Otis, broad-shouldered, stubborn, wearing a prosthetic leg he hated people noticing. June Calloway barely spoke at first. Otis said she sat near the middle seats holding a cloth bag tight in both hands, a widow from the valley with a seamstress's hands and a grief that had traveled up the mountain with her. None of them were children. None of them were helpless in the simple way a rescue report likes to imagine. They were adults with histories, pride, exhaustion, and pain old enough to have learned disguises. That made the situation more dangerous, not less. People who had practiced endurance often waited too long to admit they were in trouble. At first Della told them exactly what any responsible sheriff would tell a stranded vehicle in winter: stay inside, conserve heat, keep the exhaust clear if anyone could do so safely, avoid wandering into whiteout, and wait for help. She put Amos Tilden's plow crew on alert, called County Rescue, and sent a deputy as far up the pass as the road would allow. The answer came back ugly. Visibility was falling by the minute. A tree had dropped across the lower switchback, not fully blocking the road but slowing any heavy vehicle to a crawl. Snow was stacking along the bend near 19, and if the shuttle's rear wheels were already drifting toward the soft shoulder, waiting might not remain safer for long. Della called Milo Kessner next, because there were things official maps refused to remember in Milo, as the county's lean, restless mountain road maintenance man, remembered them all. His voice came through from a plowed depot with machinery roaring behind him. "If they're really at 19, the main road won't hold much longer," he said. "Wind rolls off the west face there. It'll bury the lane and polish the ice underneath. You won't get a rescue rig up before dark." Della asked about alternate access. Milo hesitated only because he disliked giving dangerous answers. "Ridge Lantern side approach might get a snowmobile close. Maybe. But only someone who knows the old shelter markers should try it. Otherwise they'll overshoot the draw and end up under the Cornice line." Della did not need him to say the name. There had been a time when Cross Winter Guide Service would have been the first call for exactly this kind of road. There had been a time when Benton Cross and Mara Cross knew every marker, every wind shadow, every old ranger shelter between the pass and the valley. Then Mara did not come home, and Benton became a man the town asked only for repairs because repairs had edges that grief could understand. Della stood with the receiver in her hand longer than she liked. Calling Benton felt unfair. Not calling him felt worse. She tried the shuttle again and got Naomi. The nurse's voice had thinned. "Sheriff, the heater's cycling cold now. We're keeping everyone together, but Harlan's leg is stiffening and June's hands are going numb. Otis is trying to restart the auxiliary, but the battery light keeps flashing. The bus is leaning more than before." In the background, Della heard wind hammering metal and a man muttering that he should have turned back at the lodge. There was no drama in it, no screaming, only the quiet beginning of a situation that could become a list of names by morning. Della called Benton's cabin. It rang 6 times before he answered. "Cross." His voice was rough, guarded, the voice of a man who expected practical requests and had already decided how little of himself to offer. Della told him the facts, not the plea. Shuttle bus. Adults. Mile marker 19. Heater failing. Road closing. Ridge Lantern side approach. She did not mention Mara until he did not answer. "No," Benton said finally. "I don't guide anymore." Della closed her eyes once. "I know. Send rescue. They're moving. They won't reach them in time if the bus shifts or the heater dies." I can mark a route over radio. Milo says radio directions won't be enough in this visibility. The old markers are buried or iced over. Someone has to read the ground. Silence filled the line, and inside that silence Della could almost see his cabin, the packed boxes, the stove, the dog, the old sign he had not yet taken down. Benton, she said, keeping her voice level because pity would make him hang up. I'm not asking you to be who you were. I'm asking you to tell me if there is anyone else alive who can get close enough to them before dark. He did not answer, because they both knew the answer. In the cabin below Sawtooth Pass, Benton stood beside the table with the phone in one hand and Mara's red robe still lying on the floor where Sutter had placed it. The storm had thickened beyond the windows, turning the yard into a blur of slanting white. Sutter stood near the door, black and silver coat catching the stove glow, one neck ear angled toward Benton's voice, the rest of his body aimed at the road. Benton hated how familiar the moment felt. A call, a location, a route, weather closing faster than it should, people who had waited until waiting became dangerous. He had spent years building walls out of refusal, and Della's facts walked through them without raising their voice. I'm not official, he said, though it sounded weak even to him. You don't need to be official to advise us. That isn't what you're asking. No, Della admitted. It isn't. Another burst of static came through on her end, and then, faint but clear enough for Benton to hear because Della must have patched the radio near the phone, Naomi's voice spoke from the stranded shuttle. Tell Sheriff Rourke we're still here. Tell her Harlan's breathing is better if he stays still. Tell her. The signal broke, returned, and her composure cracked for half a second. Tell her we're trying not to scare each other. Benton looked down at the red rope. Sutter stepped forward and placed his muzzle lightly across it, not picking it up this time, just holding it there beneath his breath. Benton remembered Mara tightening that same rope around her shoulder, smiling at him in a storm shelter years ago, saying, "No one should have to cross winter alone." He had spent so long hearing that sentence as an accusation that he had forgotten it had first been a promise. The decision did not feel heroic when it came. It felt like admitting defeat to the part of him that wanted leaving to be simple. Benton set the phone on speaker and began moving. Della, listen carefully. They stay in the bus until I reach them unless the frame shifts again. Have Otis clear the tailpipe only if he's clipped to something and has visibility to the door. Nobody walks beyond the headlights. Tell Naomi to keep them talking and keep wet gloves off skin. I'll take the snowmobile through the east service cut and try for the lower marker line. Della's voice changed then, not warmer exactly, but steadier with relief she would not insult him by showing too much. Copy that. Benton pulled on his worn olive canvas jacket over the dark shirt he had been packing all day, then added insulated bibs, weather shell, gloves, headlamp, and a rescue harness from the bin he had told himself he would sell. He took the Ridge lantern map from the shelf, a compact medical kit, flares, thermal blankets, a handheld radio, spare batteries warmed inside his coat, ice cleats, and the red rope. Sutter watched every item appear with an intensity that made the years between them collapse. When Benton reached for the old SAR harness, Sutter stepped into it before being asked, as if the command had been waiting inside him all this time. Benton fastened the straps with hands that did not shake until the last buckle clicked. This isn't a comeback, he said quietly, maybe to Sutter, maybe to Mara's photograph still face down on the table. Sutter only stared at the door. Benton opened it, and the storm rushed into the cabin, cold enough to steal the first breath from his mouth. Outside, Sawtooth Pass had become a wall of moving white. He wheeled the snowmobile from the shed, strapped down the gear, and climbed on with Sutter settling into the rear sled cradle designed years ago for rescue runs either of them had made since Mara died. As the engine caught, Benton looked once at the half-loosened sign in the yard. Cross Winter Guide Service hung crooked in the storm, not removed, not restored, waiting like everything else. Then Benton turned the snowmobile toward the east service cut and drove into the white, not as a man returning to glory, but as a frightened man choosing, for one night more, not to leave strangers alone in winter. It took Benton Cross nearly 2 hours to reach mile marker 19, though time stopped behaving honestly once he entered the whiteout. The snowmobile fought the storm in short, brutal advances, its headlight cutting only a narrow tunnel through the moving wall ahead before the wind filled that tunnel again. Sutter rode low in the rear rescue cradle, strapped into the old harness Mara had once adjusted for him when he was younger and too eager to sit still. Now he did not waste movement. His ears stayed pinned against the wind, his amber eyes half narrowed, his body steady with the discipline of a dog that had learned long ago that panic spent heat faster than cold could steal it. Benton kept one hand on the throttle and one eye on the land beneath the storm, the rise where the road cut left, the dark blur of a buried guardrail, the way the wind changed pitch when it crossed open slope instead of timber. The radio at his chest coughed with static. Della's voice broke through every few minutes, clipped and controlled, relaying fragments from the shuttle whenever Otis Brand's failing system could push a signal down the pass. Heater cycling cold. Rear wheels settling deeper. Passengers still inside. No one walking. Good, Benton thought each time, though good had become a small word with a narrow meaning. Good meant no one had stepped into the white. Good meant no one had tried to be brave in the stupid way winter punished. Good meant he still had people to reach. The shuttle appeared first as a smear of dull yellow light under the blowing snow, then as a dark, leaning shape half swallowed by drift. Its hazard lights blinked weakly, red bleeding into white and vanishing almost at once. Benton killed the snowmobile several yards away so the engine would not drown out what he needed to hear. Wind hammered the side of the road hard enough to make the shuttle tremble on its suspension. The rear end had slipped toward the soft shoulder, and the snow bank beyond it curved downward into a ditch that the storm had hidden too well. One more hard push of wind, one wrong attempt to reverse, one person shifting weight at the wrong time, and the vehicle could slide just enough to turn inconvenience into tragedy. Benton stepped off, clipped Sutter's lead to the working harness, and felt the dog tense, not toward the bus in aggression, but toward the human weather inside it. Fear had a scent. Exhaustion had a rhythm. Sutter knew both. Otis Brand opened the shuttle door before Benton reached it, then immediately looked as if he regretted the movement because the wind knifed into the cabin. He was tall and thin beneath his driver's coat, his face drawn tight around a gray mustache, his cap still on as though keeping the uniform intact might keep responsibility from breaking loose. "I should have turned back at the lodge," he said instead of hello. Benton climbed the steps and shut the door behind him. "Not useful right now." The answer was not cruel, only exact. Otis flinched anyway, then nodded, swallowing whatever apology had been next. The inside of the shuttle smelled of damp wool, cold vinyl, old coffee, and the metallic edge of fear people tried to breathe around. Frost had begun to feather the lower windows. The overhead lights flickered with the weak battery. 4 passengers sat scattered in a pattern that revealed more about pride than comfort. Naomi Voss knelt halfway in the aisle beside a man in a fireman's coat, trying to check his breathing while hiding the tremor in her own hands. Her slate parka was unzipped enough to reach the small medical kit at her hip, her dark blonde hair escaping its low tie, her face pale but focused. Harlan Greer, broad and gray-bearded, glared at her attention as if care itself were an insult. His prosthetic leg was stretched awkwardly into the aisle, the joint stiff with cold. "I told her I'm fine," he snapped when Benton looked down. "Then stop spending energy proving it," Benton said. Harlan's mouth tightened, but he did not argue fast enough to hide that his breath was shorter than it should have been. June Calloway sat 2 rows back, wrapped in a chestnut wool coat, both gloved hands clenched around a handmade cloth bag in her lap. Her silver-gray hair had slipped loose near one ear, and she watched Benton with soft brown eyes that held apology before he had asked anything of her. People like June often apologized for taking up room even when the room was trying to kill them. The bag in her lap was damp along one corner, but she held it as carefully as if it contained something alive. Near the front, Naomi rose too quickly and had to catch a seat back. Sutter moved before Benton did, stepping into the aisle and stopping beside her knee. He did not jump, nose, or demand attention. He simply placed his head close enough to her hand that she felt warmth through the glove. Naomi looked down, startled, and for 1 second the nurse in her stopped working long enough for the woman beneath to breathe. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He's working," Benton said, but not sharply. Sutter shifted his gaze to Harlan next, then to June, then to Otis. He was reading the group in the quiet, practical way Mara had trained into him. Who shook from cold, who shook from fear, who was about to make a bad decision out of pride. Benton moved through the shuttle quickly, checking what mattered. The heater vents blew air too cool to help. The battery gauge flickered low. Snow packed against the rear quarter panel. The frame leaned just enough that he did not like the pressure on the downhill tires. He opened the door only long enough to step out and inspect the rear, clipped to the shuttle rail while the wind shoved at his shoulders, then came back in with his answer already formed and unwelcome. "We're leaving the bus." Otis closed his eyes. June pulled the bag closer. Harlan barked a humorless laugh. "In that?" "Yes." "With my leg?" "With your experience," Benton said. That landed differently. Harlan looked up. Benton pointed toward the roofline and windows. "You were fire service. You know what a structure sounds like when it starts telling you it's done." Harlan's anger faltered because he did know. The shuttle groaned under another gust, metal flexing softly beneath the wind. Benton let the sound speak for him. "Heater won't hold. Battery is failing. Rear wheels are settling. If we wait until dark, we may not get everyone out while they can still walk." Naomi pressed her lips together. "How far?" "Not far if we do it right. Too far if we do it stupid." "That's not comforting," Otis said. "It wasn't meant to be." He could have ordered them then. The old part of him knew how, voice hard, command simple, fear converted into motion. But these were not recruits, not victims waiting to be arranged, and Benton saw the danger in treating them that way. Their resistance was not ignorance. It was the armor they had each built to survive something before the storm ever found them. Naomi would work herself into collapse before admitting her own hands were numb. Harlan would injure himself rather than accept an arm. June would freeze holding on to a memory if someone tried to take it from her by force. Otis would drown in blame unless given a task bigger than regret. Benton had spent years avoiding people because he understood too well how much weight they carried without showing it. Now that knowledge had to become useful. He took the red rope from his pack and laid it down the aisle. "Nobody is being carried unless they can't stand. Nobody is proving anything. We leave as a line, or we don't leave." Harlan snorted. "Sounds like being tied up." "It's being tied together." Benton looked at him until the difference reached the old firefighter beneath the pride. Sutter went to June next. The dog lowered himself at her feet, body angled away, offering nearness without pressure. June's grip tightened on the cloth bag, then slowly loosened. "It's my husband's coat," she said, though no one had asked. "I know it's foolish." "No," Benton said. "It's heavy." Her eyes filled at the correction, and that was when she let Naomi tuck a thermal blanket around her shoulders. Sutter rose and moved to Otis, sitting beside the driver's seat until the older man stopped staring at the windshield and looked down. "Count them," Benton told Otis. "Every stop. Every turn. You count us out loud." Otis blinked. "I drove them into this. Then help me bring them out." That gave him somewhere to put the guilt. He took the spare radio Benton handed him and nodded once, harder than necessary. They prepared in pieces. Naomi checked fingers, speech, and alertness with a professionalism that steadied her once she accepted Benton's instruction to report her own condition too. Harlan tested the lock of his prosthetic knee, then grudgingly allowed Benton to adjust a support strap without treating the act like surrender. June took the reflective markers from Benton's kit and tied them to short loops of cord with hands that remembered thousands of stitches, her motions becoming surer with each knot. Otis repeated the passenger count until it became rhythm rather than apology. Benton clipped them into the rope line, himself at front, Harlan close enough to advise on footing but not enough to overpace, Naomi behind him where she could see everyone's faces, June in the center protected from the worst gusts, Otis near the rear with the radio, and Sutter free on a short working line to move between them. Della's voice came through once, faint but firm, confirming that a lower rescue team would try to stage near the old ranger access if the road allowed. "Copy," Benton answered. He did not promise arrival. Promises were dangerous in mountains. He promised only the next correct action. When they opened the shuttle door, the storm entered like an animal. Wind tore warmth from the aisle in a single breath. Snow struck faces, collars, lashes. The yellow interior lights behind them suddenly looked impossibly soft, and Benton understood why people died within sight of shelter. Shelter behind you always looked safer than the unknown ahead, even when the shelter was failing. He stepped down first, boots sinking into wind-packed snow, and drove an anchor pole into the drift near the door. One by one they followed. Harlan cursed when his prosthetic foot slid, then caught himself before anyone could help too much. Naomi turned instinctively toward June, then remembered to check her own glove seal. June stumbled on the last step but kept her hands on the rope instead of the bag. Otis emerged last and looked back at the shuttle with a grief so human Benton almost softened. 5, Otis said aloud, voice shaking. 6 with the dog. Again at the marker, Benton said. They moved away from the shuttle while its hazard lights blinked behind them, already fading. Ridge Lantern Trail lay somewhere beneath the snow beyond the road cut, less a visible path than a memory buried under weather. Benton did not look for a trail the way a summer hiker would. He looked for the negative spaces, where trees opened slightly, where wind had scoured a shallow trough, where the land fell less steeply under the drift. Sutter moved through the line, checking Naomi when her breathing hitched, pausing near Harlan when anger pushed him too fast, brushing against June's knee when the wind made her turn back toward the bus. No one thanked the dog. Gratitude would come later if they lived long enough to afford it. For now, they obeyed the rope, the count, the pace. Behind them, the shuttle disappeared into the storm until only a weak red blink remained, then nothing. Benton felt the moment when everyone noticed. It passed through the rope like a tremor. Going back was no longer simple. Standing still was no longer safety. Ahead, Ridge Lantern Trail waited under the snow like an old promise Benton was not sure he still deserved to follow, but he tightened his grip on Mara's red line and led them into the white. Ridge Lantern Trail did not reveal itself to Benton Cross as a path. It emerged in fragments, in the absence of trees where trees should have been, in a shallow dip beneath wind-packed snow, in the way the storm bent around a ridge before dropping hard into the draw below. Years ago, Benton could have walked this route blindfolded in clear weather and with confidence in a storm. He had known where the old trail leaned east, where the pines thickened before the first shelter marker, where the slope turned treacherous because powder gathered over crust and lied about what waited underneath. But that version of the trail belonged to a different life. Time had shifted it. Wind had broken trees across it. Snow had buried markers, and the whiteout erased every footprint almost as soon as it formed. The red rope ran from Benton's harness back through the group like a single fragile decision stretched between 6 living bodies and 1 dog. Sutter moved along the line with practiced economy, sometimes ahead near Benton's knee, sometimes falling back toward the others, never wasting energy, never letting the space between people grow too wide. The shuttle bus had disappeared behind them completely. Its hazard lights no longer blinked through the storm. The road was gone. The vehicle was gone. The last visible proof that retreat existed had been swallowed by white, and Benton felt that knowledge pass through the rope before anyone said it. "Keep the line loose but present," Benton called back, raising his voice only enough to beat the wind. "Do not fight the rope. Feel it." Harlan Greer answered with a grunt that was almost a curse. The old firefighter was close behind him, broad shoulders hunched beneath his worn coat, prosthetic leg moving with a careful heaviness that anger made worse. Benton could hear the uneven scrape of Harlan's footing whenever the snow crust changed. Naomi Voss moved behind Harlan, breathing through her nose the way medical people did when they were trying to control their own body before helping anyone else. She had stopped pretending her hands were warm, but she still checked the others too often. June Calloway followed near the center, the cloth bag with her husband's coat now tucked beneath the thermal blanket instead of clutched openly, though one gloved hand returned to it every few steps. Otis Brand came near the rear, counting after each halt, his voice thin but useful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sutter makes 6, he would say, as if numbers could build a wall against guilt. Benton let him count. A task could save a man from drowning in apology. The first fallen tree cost them 10 minutes. A lodgepole pine had snapped under snow load and crashed across the old trail, its branches buried in drift so that it looked less like an obstacle than a low ridge of white. Benton tested the snow with a probe before letting anyone step near it. Hollow beneath. Too much space under the branches. A boot could punch through and twist an ankle, and an ankle in this weather could become a death sentence with paperwork attached. Harlan, despite himself, read the problem correctly. Go upslope around the trunk, he said, breath fogging hard. Not over the crown. Branches won't hold. Benton nodded. Not praise, exactly. Permission. You heard him, he called. Short steps. Weight over your feet. No rushing. Harlan's shoulders eased by a fraction. Being needed reached him more effectively than being helped. Sutter waited beside the detour, watching each person cross the safest strip. When June hesitated, the dog stepped down first, placed his paws carefully, then looked back as though showing the route belonged to the whole group, not just Benton. June followed him with small steps, lips moving silently. Maybe prayer. Maybe a name. After the fallen tree, the wind worsened. It came from the left now, striking the lines sideways and pressing everyone toward the deeper drift below. Benton shortened the rope spacing and changed the rhythm. 20 steps, stop. 20 steps, check. 20 steps, count. The method slowed them but prevented the small mistakes that fatigue disguised as impatience. Naomi began coughing after the third stop. She turned her face away from the group as if the sound embarrassed her. Sutter heard it at once. He moved past Harlan and stood in front of her until she had to stop walking. Naomi tried to wave him off. I'm fine. Benton did not turn immediately. He adjusted the rope anchor around a tree trunk and let the silence challenge the lie. Report, he said. Naomi closed her eyes once, irritated at herself more than at him. Cold or cough. Hands numb at the tips. Still oriented. Still moving. Good. Sip water. I can wait. That wasn't a question. Harlan muttered. Nurses make terrible patients. For the first time since leaving the shuttle, Naomi almost smiled. The moment was small, but small moments were sometimes the only kind winter allowed. A quarter-mile farther, Harlan tried to overtake Benton on a slope where the trail narrowed. It was not stupidity. It was pride under stress, the old reflex to move first, prove first, make the body obey by force of will. His prosthetic foot struck hidden ice, slid, and the rope snapped tight against Benton's hip. Before Benton could speak, Sutter cut across Harlan's path and stopped squarely in front of him, chest low, eyes fixed, not threatening but immovable. Harlan stared down at the dog, breathing hard. Move! Sutter did not. Benton stepped back carefully. He is not blocking you because you are weak, Benton said. He is blocking you because you are about to make the whole line pay for your pride. The words were hard, but not loud. Harlan's face darkened beneath the cold burn. For a second Benton thought the man might explode. Instead Harlan looked past him into the white, jaw working. I know what it is to slow people down, he said. Benton felt the sentence hit the rope between them. Then you know what it is to keep people alive by staying in formation. Harlan looked down at Sutter again. Dogs got bad manners. Dogs got training. After a breath, Harlan stepped back into his place. They moved on. Benton checked the map twice, though looking at it gave him less certainty each time. The landmarks were there in name but not in shape. A shallow creek bed had vanished beneath drift. A cluster of 3 pines he remembered as a guidepost had become 2 standing trunks and a jagged stump. The first reflective marker was missing from the tree where he expected it. He told himself the bark had split, the strap had failed, the snow had buried it. He found the second marker only because a sliver of dull red flashed when his headlamp swept low under an overhang. It was iced over but present, a faint confirmation that memory still knew something. The third did not appear. Benton widened his search in careful arcs, keeping the group anchored in place while Sutter circled short and tight around him. The storm closed in until everyone beyond 10 feet became a shape. The wind filled his hood with a roar that sounded too much like the night Mara died. He had been certain then too. That was the thought he had been avoiding since the call from Della. Not reckless. Not careless. Certain. He had read the ridge, measured the storm window, chosen the route that should have brought the team home. Later, people told him conditions changed. Later, official language called it an unforeseeable shift. Later, survivors insisted Mara had turned back by choice for someone who had fallen behind. Benton had nodded to all of it, and still carried the private verdict. He had believed himself right, and belief had not been enough. Now he stood in another wideout with another group behind him, another dog at his side, another red line disappearing into weather, and the trail refused to match the man who remembered it. "Benton?" Naomi's voice came thin through the wind. "Are we stopped for a reason?" He looked down at the map in his gloved hands. The papers shook, not from the wind alone. If they angled too high, they risked the cornice zone under the west face. Too low, they could enter the creek cut and lose time they did not have. Turning back was no longer simple. Their tracks had already softened, and the shuttle was not a promise of heat anymore. He felt the old command rise in him, not from confidence but fear. Turn them around before you lose them, retreat before the mountain takes another name from you. His mouth opened. The order nearly came. Sutter moved first. The German shepherd slipped a few steps beyond the rope's comfortable range, not lunging, not chasing scent into nowhere, only angling toward a wind-bent pine that leaned over a mound of drift. Benton caught the harness line. "Sutter!" The dog stopped, looked back once, then lowered his head and began pawing at the snow beneath the tree. "Leave it!" Benton said, sharper than he meant. Sutter dug again, purposeful, front paws cutting through powder and crust. Harlan said from behind him, "What's he got?" Benton almost answered nothing, because nothing would have been easier. Then his headlamp struck a color beneath the snow. Red. Not bright anymore. Not clean. A faded strip of technical rescue fabric, half frozen into the bark near the base of the pine, its reflective face dulled by ice but still stitched around a nylon core. Benton dropped to one knee so suddenly the rope pulled tight behind him. He brushed snow away with his glove, then with his bare fingers when the glove proved too clumsy. The cold bit him instantly, but he did not stop. The marker was real. Old, weathered, still tied with the flat double wrap Mara used because knots froze less tightly that way. He knew her work before he let himself know what it meant. For years, the memory of Mara had come to him as absence, an empty chair, a face-down photograph, a rope left unused, a route that had not brought her home. Now, in the wideout, she appeared not as loss but as preparation. A thing she had done with living hands had remained under snow, waiting not to haunt him, but to help. June saw his face before he spoke. "Is it hers?" Benton could not answer at once. His throat closed around the storm. Sutter stood beside him, snow clinging to the nicked edge of one ear, eyes steady as if this had been the only possible outcome of remembering. Benton touched the marker once more, then tied one of June's fresh reflective strips higher on the tree where the group could see it. "This is the trail," he said, and his voice sounded different to himself. Not free of fear. Only no longer ruled by it. "We continue east by southeast. Short line. No drifting upslope." Harlan nodded. Naomi checked June's face. Otis counted without being asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sutter makes 6. Benton folded the map and put it away. He did not throw out memory. He simply stopped asking it to do all the work alone. Mara's marker had not saved them by magic. It had saved them because years earlier, someone had cared enough to prepare for strangers she might never meet. Benton took the rope again, felt the line answer behind him, and led them forward into the storm with the red marker at their backs and, for the first time that night, something like trust ahead. The old ranger station appeared at the edge of Benton Cross's headlamp like something the mountain had almost finished burying. At first it was only a darker block inside the white, a hard angle where the storm should have shown only trees and drift. Then the roofline emerged, low and sagging beneath a heavy load of snow, the porch rail half swallowed, the old Forest Service sign twisted on one rusted chain. Years ago, Benton had remembered this place as a pause in the storm. A stove, dry benches, emergency blankets sealed in a metal locker, a hand-crank radio bolted near the supply shelf, and enough roof over your head to let fear loosen its grip. That memory had pulled the group forward for the last brutal stretch of Ridge Lantern Trail. It had given Naomi something to count toward, Harlan something to measure his pace against, June something warmer than the damp weight of the cloth bag tucked under her blanket, and Otis a destination to name into the radio whenever static allowed. But when Benton reached the porch and set one gloved hand against the doorframe, the wood shifted under his palm with a soft complaint that traveled straight through his chest. The station was still standing, but standing was not the same as safe. "Hold here," Benton called back. His voice had gone hoarse from wind and cold. The rope line tightened as the others stopped behind him, shapes bent beneath hoods and frost. Sutter moved to the porch first, nose low, paws careful, reading the threshold before Benton crossed it. The German shepherd did not growl. He only paused, ears forward, then looked back at Benton with that steady working dog attention that had never meant comfort alone. Benton opened the door slowly. Snow had blown through a broken side window and drifted across the floor in a pale wedge. Someone had nailed boards over the frame long ago, but the boards had warped and split, leaving enough space for weather to get inside. The stove sat in the corner, black and cold. The wood box held only a few pieces of dry kindling beneath a crust of damp bark. The emergency locker had been opened before. 2 blankets remained, stiff but usable, and a cracked plastic tub held matches sealed in wax paper. The hand-crank radio was still on the shelf where Benton remembered it, but when he turned the handle, the unit gave one weak chirp and died into a wet silence. Moisture had bloomed under the casing. Useless. Above them, the roof groaned under another gust and a slow hiss of loose snow slid down the outside wall. Naomi entered last because Benton ordered the line in carefully, one at a time, avoiding the softest boards near the window. Her face looked too pale beneath the rim of her hood, though her eyes remained alert and irritated by her own limits. Harlan stepped through the doorway with a curse when his prosthetic foot caught the threshold, then recovered before anyone could steady him. June came in clutching the rope with one hand and the bag under her coat with the other, her cheeks wet from wind or tears, impossible to tell. Otis counted them as soon as the door closed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sutter makes 6. The habit had become part of him now, a thin line drawn across his guilt. Benton nodded. "Again when we move." "Move?" June asked, and the question carried more than one fear. Benton looked at the sagging rafters, the wet radio, the broken window, the poor wood supply. He did not answer immediately, because a hard truth delivered too quickly could sound like cruelty. Harlan answered first, eyes traveling along the ceiling with the old firefighter's instinct returning beneath exhaustion. "Roof's loaded wrong," he said. "Back corner's taking more weight than it should." Benton looked at him. "How long?" Harlan's jaw worked. "Depends on wind. Depends if the drift slides clean or packs harder. Not a place I'd sleep under." That was the answer Benton had already known and hated. His first instinct was to do everything himself. It came so naturally that he had his hand on the door before he noticed the pattern. Check the roof. Clear the broken window. Find dry fuel. Test the back wall. Make the calls. Decide the route. Carry the blame when the route turned ugly. He had lived inside that rhythm so long it felt like competence instead of isolation. "Stay here," he said, reaching for the door latch. "I'll check the roofline and woodshed." Sutter moved between him and the door. Not fast, not dramatic. The dogs simply stepped into the narrow space, body square, head low, harness dusted with snow. Benton frowned. Move! Sutter did not. Benton felt the old irritation flare, sharpened by cold and fear. Sutter! The dog looked past him toward the group, then back to Benton. It was not disobedience for its own sake. Mara had trained him to block a handler who tried to break formation under elevated risk, especially in whiteout and fatigue conditions. Benton knew that. He had taught the drill beside her. He had praised the dog for it years ago. Now the same training stood in his way because the dangerous person in the room was not Harlan pushing too fast or June reaching for a lost object. It was Benton trying to step outside alone because fear had convinced him that responsibility meant solitude. The realization struck harder than the wind. Benton's hand fell from the latch. For a few seconds he heard only the roof, the storm, Naomi's controlled cough, and Sutter's steady breathing. He turned back to the room. 5 people looked at him with varying degrees of exhaustion, suspicion, hope, and need. None of them had asked him to become the whole mountain. He had assumed it. Just as he had assumed too much the night Mara died. Just as he had assumed, for years afterward, that if blame belonged entirely to him, then pain could at least be organized. I need everyone, he said. The words came out blunt, almost clumsy. They were harder than ordering the evacuation from the shuttle, harder than admitting the marker was Mara's, harder than driving into the pass. Harlan blinked. Naomi looked up sharply. June's grip eased around the bag. Otis stood a little straighter, as if a task had reached him before panic could. Benton forced himself to continue. This building is not safe enough to rest in long. We use it to regroup, warm what we can, repair what we can, and plan the next move. I can't do all of that alone. He almost added an apology. He did not. The group did not need apology. They needed truth. The station changed after that. Not because it became safer, but because the people inside stopped waiting to be arranged. Naomi took command of bodies with a calm that returned as soon as Benton made space for it. She checked fingers, ears, speech, and coordination, then sorted them by need without asking permission from pride. June sits closest to the stove if we get flame. Otis, you drink first because your lips are blue. Harlan, stop glaring at me and flex your foot before the socket stiffens more. Harlan muttered something unkind but obeyed. Then he turned his attention to the structure, moving carefully along the wall with one hand raised, listening to the roof instead of the storm. Nobody stands under that back beam, he said. If the load shifts, it'll come down toward the window side. We keep weight near the front wall and leave the door path clear. Otis, given permission to be useful, opened the emergency bag from the shuttle and pulled out seat pads, a folded reflective tarp, and 2 thin insulation panels. These came from the rear bench storage, he said. Didn't think they'd matter. They matter, Benton said, and watched some of the collapse in Otis's face ease. June's hands, though stiff, found work in thread and fabric. She reinforced a torn strap on Naomi's medical pouch, wrapped strips of dry cloth around Naomi's gloves for extra warmth, and stitched a quick patch over a rip seam in Harlan's coat sleeve with movements so precise they seemed to steady the room around her. My husband used to say a bad seam waits for bad weather, she murmured. Harlan glanced at the patch. Smart man. June did not smile, but she breathed differently after that. Benton worked too, but now he worked among them instead of over them. He set a small fire in the stove with the dry kindling and shaved curls from the inner side of a split log. The flame was weak at first, then caught enough to push a thin line of heat into the room. He and Harlan cleared snow away from the inside of the broken window and wedged the reflective tarp across the warped boards to reduce the draft. Naomi made everyone take small sips of water and chew pieces of emergency ration even when appetites had vanished. Sutter moved between them, not restless, not performing, simply present wherever tension sharpened. When Otis's hands shook too badly on the radio, Sutter sat beside his knee until the man steadied the handset. When June leaned too close to the damp corner, Sutter pressed gently against her leg and guided her back without force. Benton saw all of it, and felt a grief so strange it was nearly gratitude. Mara's work had survived in the dog, in the marker, in the rope, and now in the way strangers inside a failing shelter began to become a team. The radio connection came back in a ragged burst just as Benton finished replacing the batteries in the handheld and lifted the antenna toward a crack near the window. "Cross, this is Milo, do you read?" The voice was thin, chopped by static, with machinery and wind behind it. Benton pressed the transmit button. "I read you. We reached the old ranger station. Shelter compromised. Roof load heavy, window broken, crank radio dead. Group alive. Mild cold exposure. Still mobile." Milo Kestner exhaled so loudly the static carried it. "Good to hear your voice. Listen, main road is worse. Trees down across the lower switchback. Plow can't get above 12. Small slide came off the west cut and buried part of the road behind the shuttle. Going back is no good." Benton looked at the group before asking the question. "Ridge lantern forward?" Milo hesitated. "Bad. Wind's packing the upper trail. Dell is trying to stage a team low, but they can't climb to you. Options." Another crackle. "Old Flume Cut." Harlan looked up at the name. So did Benton. The room seemed to cool despite the stove. Milo continued quickly, as if speed might make the suggestion less dangerous. "It runs lower than the ridge wind, follows the old timber flume line down toward Miller's Draw. Broken rail sections, ice on the boards, narrow in places. But if you can reach the lower bend before morning, Della can get a rescue team close from the valley road." Benton did not answer right away. Old Flume Cut was not a trail people chose unless the better choices had failed. It ran along the mountainside on an old wooden grade built decades earlier, where timber once slid down toward the valley. In summer, it was unstable and ugly. In winter, it became a long argument with gravity. He could already see the worst of it: rotted planks under ice, gaps in the railing, wind sweeping across exposed turns. But he could also see the roof above them, the cracked window, the poor wood supply, the road buried behind them, and the ridge trail worsening ahead. A bad option could still be the best honest option. Benton turned to the group. He did not hide the danger. He explained it plainly: narrow wooden sections, broken rails, ice, slow pace, no rushing, no pride. He also explained the alternative: a roof that might not carry the night, a return route already compromised, and cold that would keep taking from them even while they sat still. Then he stopped talking. The decision had to belong to more than him now. Harlan spoke first. "If we go, I check the boards before weight shifts." Naomi nodded. "I keep watching temperature and confusion. We stop before people stop making sense." Otis swallowed. "I keep radio and count." June lifted the roll of reflective strips she had tied from Benton's kit. "I mark what we pass." Benton looked at each of them, feeling something inside him loosen, not because the danger had lessened, but because it had been shared. Sutter stood near the door again, but this time he did not block Benton. He waited beside him, facing outward with the patience of a working dog who understood formation better than fear. Benton shouldered the pack, coiled the rope, and opened the door. The storm rushed in, but the room behind him did not feel like people he was abandoning to follow. It felt like people rising with him. They left the ranger station in a new order. Benton led, but not alone in any meaningful sense. Harlan moved close enough behind him to test the wooden grade when they reached it. Naomi watched faces and hands with a nurse's sharp eye. June carried the spare markers and the rope loops she had reinforced. Otis reported the count through the radio when the signal allowed. Sutter traveled between them, black and silver body cutting through the snow like a moving brace in the line. Behind them, the old ranger station sank back into the storm, not a refuge, not a failure, only another place where they had learned the difference between shelter and safety. Benton did not look back for long. Ahead, old Flume Cut waited somewhere below the ridge, dangerous and narrow and real. The storm had not softened. The mountain had not forgiven. But as the rope tightened between them and 5 voices answered Otis's next count, Benton realized he was no longer walking like the one man responsible for carrying all of winter on his back. For the first time since Mara died, he was leading people who were also helping lead him. Old Flume Cut did not announce itself as a road. It appeared beneath the storm as a thin, dark scar running along the shoulder of the mountain, half buried under wind-packed snow and half exposed where the gusts had scraped the old wooden grade down to black ice. Benton Cross stopped at the edge of it and lifted one gloved hand, bringing the rope line to a halt behind him. Ahead, the cut followed the slope in a narrow bend between two kinds of danger. On the left, a snow-loaded rise leaned over them with the quiet weight of something waiting to move. On the right, beyond broken rail posts and buried timber braces, the land dropped into a stand of black pines so deep the storm swallowed their trunks before the eye could measure a distance. In summer, the old flume line would have looked abandoned. In winter, it looked unfinished by God. The boards beneath the snow had once carried timber down toward the valley. Now they carried 5 exhausted adults, 1 former mountain rescuer, and a German shepherd who understood that the most dangerous part of a rescue often came when people could almost believe the worst was over. Somewhere below, beyond the ridge wind and the timberline, Elkhorn Crossing waited. But waiting did not shorten the mile. Benton turned to face the group. His headlamp cut across frost-burned faces, iced hoods, and the red rope running through them like a pulse. He did not soften his voice. Softness had its place, but not on a narrow grade with broken rail and wide-out pressing sideways. "Rules," he said. "Nobody moves fast to prove they can. Nobody lets go of the rope because they're embarrassed. Nobody steps off the line to retrieve anything unless I say it's safe. If you slip, drop your weight low and hold. If you hear me say rock line, you get left toward the stones and down on your knees. If I say stop, stop means now." Harlan Greer's jaw tightened, but he nodded first. That mattered. The old firefighter understood rules when the structure was failing. Naomi Voss pulled her scarf higher and held out one hand without being asked so Benton could check her fingers. Her pride did not like it, but she allowed it. Otis Brand repeated the count under his breath before Benton gave the signal, turning guilt into rhythm the way a man turns a key in an engine he hopes will start. June Calloway touched the cloth bag under her coat once, then forced both hands back to the rope. Benton saw it. He did not comment. Some battles did not need witnesses unless they became dangerous. They began across the flume in the order chosen at the ranger station. Benton led with the probe and headlamp, testing the snow where the boards vanished. Harlan stayed close enough behind to read the old structure, calling out when the plank sound changed from solid thud to hollow flex. Naomi moved in the center, eyes traveling from faces to hands to gate, no longer pretending her own body was outside the count. June followed beside the spare rope loops, her boots short-stepping with careful obedience. Otis came near the rear with the radio pressed beneath his coat to keep the battery warm, reporting each progress check when static allowed. Sutter ranged within the short working space between them, never ahead far enough to lead them into trust they had not earned, never behind long enough to miss a change in the line. The wind struck from the open side and tried to turn every person into a sail. It shoved Benton's shoulder, snapped June's scarf loose, and threw needles of snow into Harlan's beard until his face looked carved from frost. 10 steps. Stop. Count. 10 steps. Board check. 10 steps. Breath check. It was maddeningly slow, and that was why it worked. Halfway through the first exposed bend, Harlan tried to lengthen his stride. The old anger rose in him not as words but as pace, the body insisting it could conquer humiliation by moving faster than the weakness named against it. His prosthetic foot struck the boards too hard, skidded, and the line jolted. Benton turned sharply. Harlan already knew. The shame in his face was worse than the stumble. "I've got it," he growled. "Then prove it by matching the pace," Benton said. It could have become a fight if the storm had given them enough room for pride. It did not. Naomi leaned close enough for Harlan to hear without the others fully catching it. "Fast is not strong right now." Harlan looked at her, breathing hard. Maybe from exertion. Maybe because the words had touched the part of him that still remembered rushing into burning buildings before anyone could tell him not to. He looked down, reset the angle of his prosthetic foot, and stepped again, slower. "Fine," he muttered. "Slow heroics." Benton almost smiled. "Best kind tonight." They crossed the second bend with the mountain hidden so completely that Benton navigated by slope pressure, wind direction, and the sound of the old flume beneath their boots. Naomi's cough came back, deeper this time, and Otis noticed before Benton did. "Naomi," he called, voice cracking. "Check." She opened her mouth to dismiss him, then stopped because she had heard Benton's rules too. She held up 2 fingers, then 3, testing herself. "Still clear." "Cold cough." "I need 20 seconds." Harlan braced the line without complaint. June pulled a dry cloth strip from inside her sleeve and handed it back to Naomi for her mouth and nose. No one made a speech about teamwork. No one needed to. The line had begun to think before Benton ordered it to. That frightened him more than he expected, because it meant he was not the only thing keeping them alive. For years, he had mistaken that truth for danger. Now, on a frozen strip of timber with darkness below, it felt like mercy. The gust that took June came without warning. One moment they were moving in low formation along a stretch where the rail posts had snapped off at knee height. The next, wind slammed across the open side hard enough to blind them all with airborne snow. June's boots slipped on ice hidden under powder. She dropped low as instructed, but the cloth bag under her coat tore loose from where she had tucked it and slid out from beneath the thermal wrap. It hit the boards, rolled once, and skidded toward the edge where the broken rail opened to the slope. June made a sound Benton had not heard from her before, not a scream, not even a cry, but a name broken into breath. Her hand left the rope. Instinct moved faster than grief could be reasoned with. She lunged after the bag. Sutter crossed the gap like a dark shape cut from the storm. He did not bark. He did not bite her coat or drag her back. He planted himself sideways between June and the edge, broad chest against her knees, head low, weight braced so firmly that she struck him and stopped. The bag slid beyond them, tipped once against a buried rail post, then vanished over the lip into the white. For a second, the entire line froze around the loss. June stared at the empty edge as if the mountain had taken her husband a second time. Then her knees folded into the rope. Naomi reached her from behind, not pulling too hard, just anchoring her. "June!" she said. June shook her head wildly, tears freezing almost as soon as they reached her cheeks. "That was his coat. I had it all this time. I had it." Benton crouched in front of her, keeping one hand on the line and one eye on the slope. The wrong words would have been easy. "It was only a coat, you did the right thing, we have to move." All true. All useless. He thought of Mara's photographs face down on the table, of the red rope he had treated like a wound instead of a tool, of how grief could disguise itself as loyalty until it pulled a person toward the edge. "You didn't leave him," Benton said. June looked at him as if she hated him for being alive enough to answer. "You're living past the place where he could walk with you. That isn't betrayal." The words did not heal her. They kept her from reaching again. For now, that was enough. Sutter remained against her knees until her hand found the rope. Only then did he step back. They moved again because stopping too long would have turned mercy into risk. June cried quietly for the next 100 yards, but she walked. Harlan stayed behind her without being asked, shortening his stride to match hers. Naomi watched June's face, then Benton's, because she understood now that grief could become a symptom as dangerous as cold. Otis counted more loudly at each stop, not to hurry them but to prove aloud that everyone still belonged to the same line. The flume narrowed near the last slope, where the old grade curved under a low band of rock. Benton felt the change before he heard it. The snow underfoot had a tighter crust, the wind above them had dropped into a hollow quiet, and the slope to the left carried too much loaded weight for its angle. He raised his hand. The group stopped. Somewhere above, behind the veil of blowing snow, a crack opened in the mountain. It was not loud. That made it worse. A long, dry, splitting sound traveled beneath the storm, followed by a soft settling rush. Benton's body remembered before his mind completed the thought. The night Mara died had begun with a sound like that, small enough to doubt, serious enough to punish doubt. He felt the old terror slam into him with full force, not as memory but as command: run them forward, outrun the slide, get clear before the mountain decides. His muscles prepared for it. His mouth opened. Then he saw Sutter. The German shepherd stood on the line between him and the group, paws planted, head turned toward Benton, waiting. Not directing. Not knowing more than a trained dog could know. Waiting for the human to choose with judgment instead of panic. Benton forced himself to listen past fear. The crack was above and slightly behind. The slope angle near the rock band offered a shallow safe pocket if they got low against it. Running forward would put the group across an exposed section with broken rail. They would scatter. Someone would fall. He saw it all in 2 seconds, and for once the old memory did not make the choice for him. Experience did. Rock line! He shouted. Left! Down! Knees and elbows! Hold the rope! Harlan moved first, driving his shoulder toward the low stones. Naomi pulled June down with her. Otis dropped so hard his radio banged against the boards. Benton threw his weight back into the rope and felt every person answer. Snow came over the edge in a sliding sheet, not a full avalanche, not the mountain tearing itself loose, but enough to knock a standing person over the rail and erase the flume behind them. It rushed past with a deep, powdery hiss, spilling across the boards where they had been walking minutes before, sweeping loose snow and debris into the trees below. The force slapped Benton's back and filled his hood with white. He held the rope until his shoulders burned. Then the rush thinned, fell away, and left the world strangely quiet. No one spoke at first. Benton lifted his head. His lamp showed Harlan pressed against the rocks, teeth bared with effort. Naomi still had one arm around June. Otis lay flat with both hands locked on the rope. Sutter stood half buried to the chest in powder, shaking snow from his face but still on his feet. Count, Benton said, barely above a whisper. Otis's answer came raw and immediate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sutter makes 6. The number moved through Benton like warmth. He closed his eyes for one breath only. Not relief. Not yet. Respect. They had listened. He had chosen. The mountain had moved, and they were still there. The slide had buried the section behind them but left the lower curve open. They could not go back now even if anyone had wanted to. Benton cleared snow from Sutter's harness, checked June's grip, checked Naomi's eyes, checked Harlan's prosthetic lock, checked Otis's radio. No one complained about being checked anymore. That, too, was survival. They continued along the last white mile with the storm beginning to thin in ragged places below the tree line. At first Benton thought the pale glow ahead was another trick of snow and fatigue. Then the glow separated into beams, moving slowly back and forth across the lower draw. Headlights. More than one vehicle. A faint red flash. Then Della Rourke's voice broke through Otis's radio, clearer than it had sounded all night. Cross team, we have visual light from the lower cut. Hold your line and keep descending. We're at the pickup point. No one cheered. They were too cold, too tired, too aware that a visible light was not the same as a hand around the shoulder. But something changed in the rope. It loosened without weakening. June lifted her head. Harlan exhaled a laugh that was mostly disbelief. Naomi wiped ice from her lashes and looked at Benton as if seeing the man not as rescuer, not as patient, but as someone who had finally stopped mistaking help for failure. Otis spoke into the radio, voice breaking around the count. We are 6. Still 6. Benton looked down at Sutter, whose black and silver coat was crusted white from chest to tail, whose nicked ear flicked toward the lights below. Then Benton looked back at the people tied to Mara's red rope. He had not carried them over the mountain. He had not saved them by being unbreakable. They had crossed the worst mile by obeying the line, giving up the pride that would have killed them, and standing together when the mountain moved. The lights of Elkhorn Crossing burned below them through the storm, not close enough to touch yet, but close enough to believe in. Benton tightened his grip, stepped onto the descending cut, and led them toward the waiting beams. They reached Elkhorn Crossing when the dark was beginning to loosen, but morning had not yet found color. The snow still fell, but it no longer came sideways with teeth in it. It drifted down over the valley road, over the roofs of the feed store and the church, over the sheriff's vehicles lying near the community hall with their lights turning the snow red, blue, then white again. Benton Cross saw the open doors first. Warm light spilled from them in a wide rectangle across the plowed entry, and people moved inside that light with blankets, thermoses, folding chairs, and the careful urgency of a town that knew silence could be useful but not when bodies were cold. No one cheered when the rope line came down the last slope. No one shouted Benton's name. The rescue did not end in triumph. It ended in hands reaching out at the right moment. Sheriff Della Rourke stood beside the entrance in her navy winter jacket, short gray hair dusted with snow, her face stern enough to hold back emotion until everyone was counted. Otis Brand spoke before she could. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sutter makes 6. His voice broke on the last number, and this time no one corrected him. Della's eyes moved from Otis to June, from June to Naomi, from Naomi to Harlan, from Harlan to Benton, then down to Sutter's snow-crusted harness. She nodded once. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. That nod held the entire night, the call, the storm, the trail, the old station, the flume, the slide, the fact that the line had arrived whole. Maeve Larkin met them at the threshold with a stack of wool blankets pressed against one hip and a look that could have organized an army out of exhaustion. She was in her mid-50s, red hair threaded with silver and twisted into a low knot, green eyes sharp with warmth rather than softness. Her cardigan was half hidden beneath an apron, as if she had dressed for a church supper and a disaster at the same time. "Inside," she said, not unkindly, but in a tone that left no room for argument. "Boots stay on the mat if you can feel your toes, off if you can't. Coffee to the left, med check to the right. Nobody disappears before I see your face under proper light." Harlan opened his mouth, probably to object to being managed, then looked at Maeve and chose survival. Naomi was led toward a table where an EMT checked her hands while she tried to explain that others needed attention first. Maeve cut through that with a mug of warm broth. "Nurses sit too." Harlan lowered himself into a chair with the care of a man pretending the chair had requested it, and one of the deputies brought a dry towel for his prosthetic socket. June stood just inside the door, empty-handed now, staring at the place where her cloth bag had been for so long that Benton almost stepped toward her. Sutter reached her first, not pressing, only standing close enough that the warmth of his body met the side of her coat. June lowered one hand to the dog's head and did not cry loudly. That, too, was a kind of strength. Benton remained near the doorway longer than anyone noticed at first. He had spent years mastering exits. Finished the repair, refused a meal, leave before gratitude asked for a story. It was a habit older than the storm and almost as strong. The community hall was too bright, too warm, too full of people looking at one another with relief that had nowhere to go yet. He could feel thanks gathering in the room, and thanks had always frightened him more than blame because blame at least matched what he believed about himself. He unclipped his end of Mara's red rope and began coiling it with stiff hands. "I'll bring the rest of the gear in from the sled," he said to no one in particular. He took one step backward toward the cold. Sutter did not follow. The German shepherd sat in the doorway between the hall and the snow, harness still on, black and silver coat crusted white along the shoulders, amber eyes fixed on Benton with the same steady patience he had shown at the cabin. Not pleading. Not commanding. Waiting. Benton stopped. Behind Sutter, the hall smelled of coffee, wet wool, wood polish, and human beings who had survived because they had stopped trying to survive separately. Outside, the street waited with all its old permissions: leave quietly, go home, pack the last boxes, tell yourself the job is done. Naomi came to him before he could choose the easier thing. A blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, and her hands were red from warming too fast, but her gaze was steady. "You got us down," she said. Benton shook his head at once. "The line got you down." "Exactly." She let the words settle. "You led us, but you did not carry us. There's a difference. Some of us needed to learn that tonight." She looked at her own hands when she said it, and Benton understood she was not only talking about him. Harlan joined them a moment later, moving with his uneven, stubborn dignity. He held out his hand. Benton took it. The grip was firm, not grateful in the weak way Harlan would have hated, but respectful in the language of men who had both known danger and disliked being seen inside it. "Dog stopped me from being an idiot twice," Harlan said. "You stopped yourself the second time." Harlan grunted. "Don't ruin my compliment." June approached last, slower than the others. Maeve had given her a square of dry cloth to wrap around her fingers, and from that cloth June unfolded a small piece of fabric, dark and worn, cut from the lining of her husband's old coat before the rest had been lost to the slope. "It tore loose when the bag opened," she said. "I found it tucked in my sleeve." She placed it in Benton's palm. "I don't need to carry all of it anymore." Benton looked down at the small piece of cloth. It weighed almost nothing. He knew better than to mistake that for lightness. "You sure?" he asked. June nodded. "Keep it with the red marker. Not as sadness. As proof people can keep walking." Otis waited until the others had moved away. He stood with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, shoulders bent, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I should have turned back earlier," he said. "I keep hearing the moment I knew and kept going." Benton did not rush to forgive him. Forgiveness given too quickly could sound like dismissal. "Maybe you should have," he said. Otis flinched, but Benton held his eyes. "And maybe I should have chosen differently years ago. Maybe Harlan should have slowed sooner. Maybe June should have let go faster. Maybe Naomi should have admitted she was cold before her hands went numb. Survival can't become a hunt for one person to hang all the fear on." Otis breathed in, shaky and old. "Then what do I do with it?" Benton looked toward Della, who was writing notes near the door, then toward the storm-softened windows. "You learn from it before it turns into shame. Shame makes people hide. Hiding gets people killed in winter." Otis nodded, not healed, but steadier. Sometimes steadier was enough for one morning. A few days passed before Benton understood that he had not left. The storm moved east. Roads reopened in sections. The shuttle was recovered half buried and crooked near mile marker 19. The old ranger station roof partially collapsed under a later load of snow, proving Harlan right in a way no one celebrated. Benton returned to his cabin with Sutter and found the boxes waiting exactly where he had left them. For an hour, he stood among them as if they belonged to someone who had planned a departure in another lifetime. Then he opened the first box. Not to pack more, but to unpack. He hung the Ridge Lantern map back on the wall, not as a monument to what he had failed to control, but as a working map with new notes in pencil. He repaired the radio and moved it closer to the door. He placed Mara's red rescue rope on its old hook, not hidden under the bench, and tied her faded marker beside it with June's small scrap of coat lining tucked into the knot. Sutter watched from the rug near the stove, head on his paws, as if satisfied that the cabin had finally stopped pretending to be temporary. Della came by that afternoon with no ceremony, only a folder under one arm and snow melting on her boots. "Town wants winter readiness sessions," she said. "Not lectures. Practical training. Weather reading, vehicle kits, radio use, rope lines, hypothermia signs, when to call before pride turns expensive." Benton leaned against the doorframe. "Town wants or you want?" "Both." She looked past him at the map on the wall. "Naomi offered to teach cold exposure basics. Harlan says he can talk about structure, ice load, and not being too proud to use a rope, though he used rougher words. Otis wants to help with driver checklists. June said she can make reflective ties and repair gear. Maeve already volunteered the hall, Which means the hall has been volunteered whether I asked or not. Benton looked toward Sutter, who had lifted his head at the sound of all those names. And what do you want from me? Della's expression softened just enough to make the answer human. Open the sign again. Not like before. Not guiding tourists through storms for cash. A small winter guide service. Training. Preparedness. Adults who think needing help is weakness. Benton almost said no. The old reflex rose and faded. Weekend sessions, he said. Small groups. No hero nonsense. Della smiled faintly. I was hoping you'd say that. The first session happened 2 Saturdays later under a pale winter sun that made the snow look gentle, which Benton explained was exactly how winter got people into trouble. They stood outside the community hall, Naomi with a medical kit open on a folding table, Harlan demonstrating how to test footing with a pole, Otis showing a checklist taped to a dashboard, June tying red reflective strips with neat, quick fingers, Maeve pouring coffee from a steel urn and correcting anyone who forgot gloves. Benton taught rope spacing, weather windows, radio calls, and the discipline of saying, I need help, before need became emergency. He did not speak of Mara as a tragedy. He spoke of her knots, her markers, her rule about ropes being useless if stored too far away. Sutter lay on the porch where sunlight met shadow, calm and watchful, occasionally lifting his head when someone mishandled a line. People laughed then, but carefully, with respect. Benton found that the sound did not hurt as much as he expected. At the end of that week, Benton walked to the old sign in front of the cabin. The bolts he had loosened before the storm were still there, rusted and waiting. He tightened them instead of removing them. Cross Winter Guide Service faced the snowy road again, weathered but standing. Beneath it, Benton fastened a new plank he had sanded by hand and painted in plain black letters. No one crosses winter alone. He tied Mara's faded red marker near the door hook afterward, not as a wound, not as an apology, but as a trail sign. Sutter stood beside him in the snow, ears forward, looking up toward Sawtooth Pass. The mountain had not changed. It was still cold, still dangerous, still capable of taking what people loved. Benton knew that better than anyone. But for the first time in years, he did not look at the pass only as the place that had taken Mara from him. He looked at it as a place where someone might still need a way home. Staying was not going back to the past. It was choosing to remain available to life. Benton rested one hand on Sutter's harness, watched the road disappear into the white pines, and let the open doorway of the cabin glow behind him. Some storms do not end by giving us back what we lost. Sometimes they end by showing us that love can still guide us forward. Benton could not bring Mara back, but through Sutter, through the red markers she left behind, and through the people who crossed that last white mile together, he learned that grief does not have to become a locked door. In our own lives, maybe healing begins when we stop trying to carry winter alone. May God give you peace for what you have lost, courage for the road ahead, and someone steady beside you when the snow gets heavy. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, hope, and finding the way home.